The hallway had gone silent except for the sound of boots, heavy, polished, marching in perfect step. A 3-year-old girl stood frozen outside a hospital room, a single wilted flower clutched in her small hand. The bed inside was empty, the machines were dark, the old man who had become her only friend was gone. Then, at the end of the corridor, tall double doors swung open. An admiral in full dress uniform stepped through first, his white cap catching the light. Behind him, 5 Navy SEALs in green camouflage fell into perfect formation, their boots striking the tile like a slow drumbeat. They were not there for the hospital administrator. They were not even there for the little girl. They were there for a secret one gentle old man had carried in silence for 58 years. And in the next few minutes, that secret was about to find the one family who never knew it existed. Before we start, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because what a lonely old man in room 118 had kept secret for 58 years was about to come walking through that door. Harborview Veterans Hospital sat on a quiet stretch of coastline, an old brick building with tall windows that let in the smell of salt air whenever someone propped a door open. It was not a fancy place. The floors were clean but worn thin, in the hallways where thousands of feet had walked over the decades. Claire Bennett had worked there for just over a year, pushing a cleaning cart from room to room, emptying trash bins, wiping down railings, doing the kind of work most people walk past without noticing. She was 29 years old and a widow, though she rarely spoke about that to anyone at the hospital. Her husband had passed 2 years earlier, and since then, it had been just her and her daughter, finding their way through each day, one shift at a time. Claire started at 7 in the morning and finished at 3 in the afternoon, and because daycare cost more than she could spare, her daughter Ivy came with her, most days after preschool let out, sitting quietly in the small supply closet on the second floor, with a coloring book and a juice box, waiting for her mother's shift to end. Ivy was 3 years old, with soft golden curls and eyes the color of a clear morning sky. She was a watchful little girl, the kind who noticed things grown-ups often missed, and she had already learned the rules of being a hospital child without anyone needing to write them down. Stay quiet, stay out of the way, do not wander the halls. Claire loved her daughter fiercely, and she worried about her just as fiercely because the world had already shown Claire how quickly a good life can be taken apart, and she did not want Ivy anywhere near trouble. But a 3-year-old can only sit still in a supply closet for so long, and one warm afternoon in early spring, while Claire was 2 rooms down stripping old linens, Ivy slipped quietly out the door and wandered down the hallway on her own, following the sunlight spilling out from a room where the door had been left open a crack. Inside that room sat a man nobody at the hospital much wanted to visit. His name was Elias Whitfield, though the staff mostly called him Mr. Whitfield, and behind his back a few of the younger nurses called him something less kind. He was 79 years old, thin in the way that men get when the years finally catch up to them, with a head of white hair that never seemed to lay flat, and pale blue eyes that had a way of looking straight through a person. He had been at Harborview for 8 months, recovering slowly from a fall that had never quite let him walk the same again, and in all that time, not a single visitor had come to see him. No family, no old friends, just the quiet hum of the heart monitor and the sound of gulls outside his window. When Ivy pushed the door open a little wider and peeked inside, Elias looked up sharply, the way a man looks up when he is not used to being disturbed. "Well," he said, his voice rough as gravel, "what do you want?" Ivy did not answer right away. She simply stood there, small and unafraid, looking at him the way children look at things they do not yet understand are supposed to be frightening. "This isn't a place for little ones to be wandering," Elias said, his tone sharp, though something in his pale eyes did not quite match the sharpness of his words. "Go on now, back to wherever you came from." Ivy took one small step backward, then stopped. In her hand she was holding a single yellow flower, plucked from the little garden bed just outside the hospital's side entrance, the kind of flower most people would call a weed if they bothered to notice it at all. She walked forward instead of away, set the flower gently on the edge of his bedside table, and turned and toddled out of the room without another word. Elias stared at the flower for a long moment. He did not throw it away. The next afternoon, Claire discovered where her daughter had gone and hurried down the hallway with her heart pounding, terrified she would find Ivy causing some kind of trouble in a stranger's room. Instead, she found her daughter standing quietly beside Elias Whitfield's bed, while the old man complained loudly about the hospital's coffee being weaker than dishwater. "I am so sorry," Claire said breathlessly, reaching for Ivy's hand. "She's not supposed to be bothering the patients." Elias waved a dismissive hand without looking away from the little girl. "She's not bothering anyone," he grumbled. "Just standing there. Doesn't say much. That's more than I can say for the rest of this place." Claire hesitated, unsure whether to apologize again or simply take her daughter and go, and in that small pause, Ivy reached into her pocket and pulled out a second flower, this one a pale blue, and set it beside the first one, which had already begun to wilt on the nightstand. Elias looked at the two flowers sitting there. Something crossed his face that Claire could not quite name, something that looked almost like pain and almost like gratitude at the very same time. "Fine," he muttered finally. "She can stay a few minutes. Just don't let her touch anything." That was how it began. A single flower, left without asking anything in return. Claire worried at first, certain the old man would grow tired of a toddler's company, or say something too harsh for a small child to hear. But each day when she came to collect Ivy, she found the same thing. Ivy sitting quietly in the chair beside his bed, and Elias, gruff as ever, allowing it. He never thanked her for the flowers. Instead, he complained about them. "Too small," he would grumble. "Picked the wrong color. Don't you know roses are the only flower worth cutting?" But every single one stayed on that nightstand, and slowly, without either of them seeming to notice it happening, a routine took root between a lonely old veteran and a little girl who did not yet know what loneliness even meant. One afternoon, while Elias sat staring out the window the way he often did, lost somewhere far from that room, Ivy began to hum. It was a soft, simple melody, the same one her mother sang to her every night before bed, a tune passed down through her family so many times that nobody quite remembered where it started. Elias went very still. His hand gripped the arm of his chair, and when Claire came to collect her daughter a few minutes later, she found the old man sitting with his eyes closed, his face wet with tears he made no effort to explain. Weeks passed this way, quiet and unremarkable to anyone who might have glanced into that room. A flower, a few minutes of humming, a cup of coffee Ivy was never allowed to touch, but always asked about anyway. Claire began to notice a change in Elias that the nurses commented on too, a little more color in his face, a little less sharpness in his voice when the staff came to check on him. What none of them knew, what not even Claire suspected, was that Elias Whitfield kept a drawer in his nightstand that he never once opened in front of another living soul, a drawer he locked every single night with a small brass key he wore on a string around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt where no one would ever think to look. And one warm afternoon, as Ivy sat swinging her legs from the tall chair beside his bed, humming that same familiar tune, Elias glanced down and noticed something hanging from a thin chain around her small neck, something small and brass and achingly, impossibly familiar, and every last bit of color drained from his face. Elias Whitfield did not move for a long moment. His eyes stayed fixed on the small brass shape hanging against Ivy's collarbone, a tiny compass no bigger than a coin, its surface worn smooth by years of small fingers and washing and time. Ivy noticed him staring and lifted the charm proudly for him to see. "My mommy gave me this," she said. It was her grandma's. Elias opened his mouth to speak and found that nothing came out. He had seen a charm exactly like that one time before, more than half a century ago, in a place far from this quiet hospital room, on a chain around the neck of a young man who would not live to see the sun rise the next morning. "Well," Elias finally managed, his voice rougher than usual, that's a fine little trinket. Hold on to it careful, you hear." Ivy nodded solemnly and tucked the charm back beneath her collar, entirely unaware that she had just cracked open a door the old man had kept sealed shut for 58 years. Over the following days, Claire noticed something different in Elias, though she could not quite name what it was. He still complained about the coffee, he still grumbled when the nurses tried to adjust his pillows, but there was a distraction behind his pale eyes now, a distance, as though part of him had wandered off somewhere Claire could not follow. He began saving the chair beside his bed for Ivy before she even arrived, pulling it a little closer each morning, and he started asking her the name of whatever flower she brought that day, listening to her small, mispronounced answers with a seriousness that seemed far too large for the question. One of the younger nurses, a kind woman named Patrice who had worked the second floor for years, mentioned it to Claire almost in passing one afternoon while restocking supplies. "He writes letters some nights," she said. "Never mails them, though. Been doing it as long as I've worked here. Just writes, folds them up, puts them in that drawer of his. Never once seen him send a single one." Claire thought little of it at the time. It was only later that the words would come back to her, turning over and over in her mind, like a stone she could not stop touching. It was on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the kind of ordinary day that gives no warning of what it is about to become, that Elias finally worked up the courage to ask. Claire had come to collect Ivy, and the old man had waved her toward the empty chair instead of simply letting her take her daughter and go. "Sit a minute," he said, and something in his voice made Claire obey without question. He was quiet for a long stretch, his hands folded tightly in his lap, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual gruffness entirely. "That charm your girl wears," he said. "Where'd it come from?" Claire, a little surprised by the question, explained what little she knew. It had belonged to her grandmother, she said, passed down through the family for as long as anyone could remember. Her grandmother's father had died overseas before she was even born, killed in the war, and this small brass compass was one of the only things left of him, a piece he'd apparently had made special before he shipped out, though nobody in the family had ever known why. Elias's face, already pale from months of illness, seemed to lose every last trace of color it had left. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his hands, folded so tightly in his lap a moment before, began to tremble. Claire leaned forward, sensing the weight in his voice, sensing that whatever he was about to say mattered in a way few things in this quiet hospital room ever had. "I've carried something," Elias started again, his breath catching strangely between the words. 58 years, I've carried it, and I never once had the nerve to." His sentence broke apart in the middle. His hand flew to his chest. His face twisted suddenly with a pain that had nothing to do with the words he had been trying to say, and before Claire could reach him, before she could even fully understand what was happening, Elias Whitfield slumped sideways in his chair, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his eyes wide with a fear that seemed to belong to a much younger man. Claire's scream tore through the quiet hallway before she even realized she had made a sound. "Somebody help!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands hovering uselessly over his shaking body, unsure what to touch, what to do, how to fix what was breaking in front of her. Ivy stood frozen by the window, her small hand still clutching the flower she had brought that day, her eyes enormous and terrified as she watched the only friend she had ever chosen for herself go pale and still in his chair. Nurses came running from both directions, Patrice among them, shouting orders down the hallway, calling for a crash cart, calling for a doctor, calling for anyone who could help. The room that had been so quiet just moments before erupted into chaos, machines beeping in frantic rhythm, voices overlapping, wheels squeaking against the floor as they rushed equipment through the door. Claire was pulled gently but firmly back out of the way, her hands still trembling, her mind still stuck on the words Elias had never managed to finish. "Here is something I want to ask you, and I hope you will not judge me for it, because I think many of us carry something similar without ever meaning to. Have you ever waited too long to say something important, only to have the moment slip away before the words could finally come out?" Elias Whitfield had waited 58 years, and in the span of a single sentence, that chance seemed to be slipping through his fingers all over again. Please share in the comments below if you have ever felt that same ache, that same fear of running out of time before the truth could finally be spoken. We read every single one, and we promise never to judge, because life has a way of teaching all of us that lesson eventually, whether we are ready for it or not. The hallway outside room 118 filled quickly with hospital staff, gurneys, and the low, urgent murmur of people trying to save a life. Claire stood pressed against the wall, with Ivy gathered tightly in her arms, watching through the open doorway as doctors worked over Elias with a speed and intensity that made her stomach twist into knots. She did not know what he had been trying to tell her. She did not know why the charm around her daughter's neck had shaken a strong, gruff old man to his very core. All she knew was that whatever secret Elias Whitfield had been carrying for 58 years, he had come within a single breath of finally setting it free. And now, as the doctors wheeled him swiftly out of the room and down the long fluorescent hallway toward the elevators, that secret hung suspended in the space between his silence and whatever words might still be waiting to save him. The intensive care unit at Harborview sat on the third floor behind a set of heavy double doors that Claire had passed 100 times without ever once thinking she would need to walk through them herself. She stood outside those doors now with Ivy's small hand gripped tightly in hers, her chest still heaving from the rush up the stairwell, watching through the narrow reinforced glass as doctors and nurses moved around Elias Whitfield's bed in a blur of motion she could not fully make sense of. A monitor somewhere inside beeped in a rhythm that did not sound right to her, too fast, too uneven, and every few seconds a voice would call out something clinical and urgent that Claire did not understand but that made her stomach drop all the same. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, as though she could somehow reach through it and steady the old man on the other side, simply by wanting it badly enough. A woman in a sharp gray blazer approached from down the hallway, her heels clicking briskly against the tile, a clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. Her name badge read Diane Kessler, Director of Patient Services, and her expression carried the particular kind of tired authority that comes from enforcing rules all day long to people who do not want to hear them. "Ma'am," she said, stopping a few feet from Claire, "I'm going to need you to step back from this area." Claire turned, still holding Ivy close. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "He doesn't have anyone else. I just want to know if he's going to be all right." Diane's face softened for half a second, before hardening right back into policy. "I understand this is difficult," she said, "but the ICU is restricted to immediate family only. Your hospital staff, and this little one, well, children certainly aren't permitted back here at all. I'm sorry. I really am, but those are the rules." Claire opened her mouth to argue, to explain that she was not trying to break any rules, that she only wanted to be near him, but Diane was already turning to walk away, her clipboard clutched firmly against her chest, leaving Claire standing helpless in the hallway with her daughter pressed against her side. Ivy tugged at her mother's sleeve, looking up with wide, worried eyes. "Is Mr. Elias going to wake up?" she asked. Claire knelt down and pulled her daughter into a tight hug, unable to find an answer that felt honest and gentle at the same time. "I hope so, sweetheart," she whispered into Ivy's soft curls. "I really, really hope so." Patrice appeared a few minutes later, still in her scrubs, her face lined with the particular exhaustion of someone who had just spent the better part of an hour fighting to keep a man's heart beating. She pulled Claire aside gently, out of earshot of the nurse's station. "They got him stable," she said quietly, "but it was close. Real close. He's not out of the woods yet, and the doctors won't know more for a while." Claire nodded, tears finally slipping free, and Patrice squeezed her arm before hurrying back through the double doors, leaving Claire once again standing in that same fluorescent hallway, with nothing to do but wait. What none of them knew, standing in that quiet corridor with their hearts in their throats, was that at that very moment, a black government sedan was pulling into the hospital's front circle, followed closely by a second vehicle carrying 5 men who moved with the kind of quiet discipline that turns heads without a single word being spoken. 3 weeks earlier, in a small, shaking hand, Elias Whitfield had written a letter to the Navy's Personnel Records Office, a letter that had sat unanswered on his nightstand for so many nights that he had nearly given up hope of it ever mattering at all. In that letter, he had asked for help finding the family of a young sailor named Thomas Bennett, killed in action in 1968, a man Elias had never once forgotten in 58 years of trying. That letter had finally landed on the desk of Admiral Marcus Reyes, a man who took such requests seriously, particularly when they came from a decorated Navy corpsman whose own file, it turned out, contained an old recommendation that had somehow been lost in the chaos of a war that ended before most people currently working at the Pentagon had even been born. Admiral Reyes had come to Harborview that morning for 2 reasons neither Claire nor Elias could have predicted. He had come to help an old man find a family he had spent a lifetime searching for, and he had come to finally deliver an honor that was 58 years overdue. The Admiral stepped out of his vehicle in full dress uniform, his white cap catching the morning light, and behind him, 5 Navy SEALs climbed out of the second car in their green camouflage, moving into formation with the kind of practiced ease that told anyone watching this was not their first time walking into a place with purpose. They crossed the lobby together, their boots striking the polished floor in a steady rhythm that drew every eye in the building, and when they reached the front desk, the Admiral asked, in a voice that was calm but left no room for hesitation, to be taken immediately to the room of a patient named Elias Whitfield. The young receptionist, flustered and clearly unprepared for 6 uniformed men standing in front of her desk, stammered that Mr. Whitfield had just been moved to the intensive care unit, that there had been some kind of emergency. The Admiral's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Take us there now," he said, and the small group turned as one and began walking toward the elevators, their boots echoing down the hallway in perfect, unbroken step. Diane Kessler was still standing near the ICU doors, reviewing something on her clipboard, when the elevator doors slid open and the Admiral stepped out, 5 Navy SEALs falling into formation behind him. She looked up, startled, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip. Can I help you?" she managed, her earlier confidence faltering completely at the sight of the gold buttons and the crisp white cap moving toward her with unmistakable purpose. "I'm here for Elias Whitfield," the Admiral said, his voice carrying easily down the corridor. "I understand he's just been brought in." Diane straightened, falling back on the only thing she knew how to fall back on. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but this is a restricted area, immediate family only, and I'm afraid Mr. Whitfield doesn't have any family listed on file." The Admiral stopped directly in front of her, close enough that Diane had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "That man in there served this country as a Navy corpsman, and he has spent the last several weeks of his life trying to find the family of a sailor who died saving lives under his care. I have every reason to believe that family may already be standing somewhere in this hospital, so before you tell me who is and isn't allowed back there, I would ask you to consider who exactly you're keeping out." Claire, still standing further down the hallway with Ivy in her arms, turned at the sound of the commotion, her breath catching as she watched 6 uniformed men fill the narrow corridor, their presence somehow making the entire space feel smaller and more serious all at once. She had no idea who they were or why they had come, only that something about the way the older man in the white cap was speaking sent a chill down her spine, a feeling she could not quite explain, as though the ground beneath her had just shifted in some way she did not yet understand. Diane Kessler, her clipboard now hanging forgotten at her side, glanced past the Admiral and caught sight of Claire and Ivy standing there, and something in her expression finally cracked. "Wait," Diane said slowly, looking between the Admiral and the young mother down the hall. "You don't mean—" The Admiral followed her gaze, and for the first time since stepping off that elevator, his composed, dignified expression shifted into something unmistakably human, something that looked, for just a moment, like a man who had just found exactly what he had been searching for. The Admiral crossed the distance between them slowly, as though he understood that whatever he was about to say deserved to be spoken gently rather than announced. He stopped a few feet from Claire and looked down at Ivy, still nestled against her mother's shoulder, the small brass charm just visible where her collar had shifted. "May I ask your name?" he said softly to Claire, and when she told him, something in his face settled, like a man setting down a weight he had carried a long way. "Mrs. Bennet," he said, "my name is Admiral Marcus Reyes, and I believe the man fighting for his life in that room has been looking for you and your daughter for a very long time, though he never knew your names, and neither did I until just now." Claire's arms tightened instinctively around Ivy. "I don't understand," she said. Reyes glanced toward the ICU doors, then back at her. "Elias Whitfield served as a Navy corpsman in Vietnam," he said. "In 1968, he was caring for a young sailor who did not survive his wounds. That sailor's name was Thomas Bennet." Claire went very still. "Her grandmother's father," she whispered, "the one who died before she was born." Reyes nodded slowly. "Before he passed," Reyes continued, his voice low, "Thomas asked Elias to make sure his daughter someday knew her father came home a hero. Elias never found the courage to deliver that message. He spent 58 years carrying it instead." Diane Kessler, still standing nearby with her clipboard forgotten at her side, stepped forward without another word about policy and pushed open the ICU doors herself. "Go on," she said quietly, her earlier firmness replaced with something gentler. "All of you." Claire moved through the doorway first, Ivy still held close against her chest, and the Admiral followed a step behind, the 5 SEALs remaining respectfully near the entrance, removing their helmets in unison as they crossed the threshold. Inside, machines beeped steadily beside the bed, where Elias Whitfield lay pale and still, tubes and wires connecting him to the quiet, careful work of keeping him alive. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow but even, a small mercy after the chaos of the hallway earlier that morning. Claire approached the bed slowly, her heart pounding, unsure what she was even hoping for, and Ivy, sensing the seriousness of the room, went unusually quiet in her mother's arms. Claire set her daughter down gently beside the bed, and Ivy, without anyone telling her to, reached up and rested her small hand over the old man's weathered one, the same way she had done 100 times before over the past several weeks, back when the two of them had simply been a lonely girl and a lonely old man passing quiet afternoons together over a single flower. She leaned close to his ear, her voice small but perfectly clear in the hushed room. "Wake up," she whispered. "I still need a friend." For a long moment, nothing happened. The machines kept their steady rhythm. Claire held her breath. And then, slowly, Elias Whitfield's eyelids fluttered, and his pale blue eyes opened, unfocused at first, then settling, one by one, on the faces gathered around his bed. His gaze found Ivy first, and something in his tired face softened immediately. Then his eyes moved to Claire, and finally, with visible effort, to the tall figure in dress uniform standing at the foot of the bed. "Raisa," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp, but unmistakable all the same. "You got my letter." The Admiral stepped closer, his composed expression cracking just slightly at the corners. "I got your letter, old friend," he said, "and it seems you found them before I ever could." Elias's eyes drifted back to Claire, and this time, when he spoke, his voice trembled with something far heavier than illness. 58 years, he said slowly. "I carried it, never had the nerve. Your grandfather, he did not finish." Instead, his hand, the one Ivy still held, turned slightly to grip her small fingers, and tears slipped freely down the deep lines of his face. Claire, standing at the bedside with her own tears falling now, understood in that moment exactly what he had been trying to tell her that Thursday afternoon, before his heart had stopped the words in his throat. In his nightstand drawer back in room 118, still locked with the small brass key he wore around his neck, Elias had kept a matching charm for 58 years, identical to the one hanging from Ivy's chain, given to him by a dying young sailor who had wanted his unborn daughter to know he loved her before he ever had the chance to meet her. Alongside it sat a stack of letters, dozens of them, each one beginning the same way. To Thomas's girl. Letters he had written and never mailed because he had never known where to send them, because the family he had promised to find had scattered and moved and rebuilt their lives in ways he could never trace, until a little girl wandered into his hospital room with a wildflower in her hand and a lullaby on her lips that he recognized after 58 years of trying to forget it. The ceremony took place 3 days later. Once the doctors were satisfied Elias had strength enough to sit upright in his wheelchair. It was a small, quiet gathering in the hospital's sunlit garden, nothing like the grand affairs held in stadiums or auditoriums, but no less meaningful for its size. Admiral Reyes stood before Elias with the 5 seals arranged in formation behind him, and in a voice that carried clearly across the small crowd of nurses and staff who had gathered to watch, he read the citation aloud, an award 58 years overdue, honoring a young Navy corpsman who had given everything he had, trying to save the men in his care. When Reyes pinned the medal to Elias's chest, the old man's hands shook, not from illness this time, but from the simple, overwhelming weight of finally being seen for something he had carried alone for far too long. Claire stood nearby with Ivy on her hip, and when Elias caught her eye across the small crowd, he gave her the faintest nod, the kind of nod that said more than any speech ever could. In the weeks that followed, Elias gave Claire the letters, all of them, along with her great-grandfather's dog tags, worn smooth from decades spent in a locked drawer, waiting for a family that had finally come looking, without even knowing they were searching. He told her, slowly and in his own time, about the modest house he had owned on the coast for 30 years, a house he had always meant to give to Thomas's family if he ever found them, and he insisted, in the same gruff, immovable way he insisted on everything, that it belonged to her and Ivy now, paid in full, waiting for them whenever they were ready. Admiral Reyes, moved by everything he had witnessed that week, arranged a small education fund through the Navy for Ivy, a modest but steady promise for whatever future she chose to build. And in the hospital garden where it had all quietly begun, a small wooden bench was placed beneath the window of what used to be Room 118, a simple brass plaque fixed to its back reading, "Thomas Bennett and Elias Whitfield, brothers in every way that matters." Ivy still visits Elias every single day, though now she understands exactly why the flowers matter so much to him, and exactly why he keeps every single one, wilted or not, in a small glass jar beside his bed. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you that it is never too late to say the thing you have been carrying, please consider subscribing to this channel, because we believe stories like this deserve to be told, and shared, and remembered. We will be here next week with another one, waiting for you.